Still just good morning, everyone. Nice to be part of a nicely gender-balanced panel, just to point that out. As a bridge to the first panel, let me state unequivocally at the outset, famines should never happen. Right? Everything that we were talking about before in terms of governance and corruption and politics, they are all essential pieces of this puzzle, and prevention of famine is absolutely the priority. That said, famines happen. They didn't for a while, but they are back, and that then requires appropriate humanitarian responses. And typically those responses, as you've just heard from Erin, require increasing technical skills, knowledge, and ability to act in ways that are not just dropping food out of the back of airplanes, but actually treating and recovering individuals who are at risk, severe risk of mortality. And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit more about. I'm giving you the takeaways right up front so that we can, if I run out of time. We talked a little bit about famine metrics and that mortality is a key one. Everyone talks immediately about the mortality rates, the death in famines. And much of that is mediated through malnutrition, the heightened risk of mortality of malnourished, vulnerable individuals, usually children, but also pregnant and breastfeeding women. So it's critical to understand this, but it's not, wasting isn't the only aspect of nutrition and health, but it is the spear tip of interventions to save lives. I would argue, and I'm going to put this perhaps as a maybe provocative, but I think it's important that we recognize that there have been some major successes over the past 15 years in responding to crises, and that is part of why we saw an hiatus in famine for a decade, is that we have, since around 2000, become very much more successful at saving the lives of those at-risk individuals who are severely malnourished, and that, as a result, reduced mortality and reduced mortality risk. It's part of the equation that often isn't taken into account, but it's success that has allowed us to not have to declare so many famines in the past decade or so. But that's almost, success can breed failure, because if you keep a child alive but don't allow that child to thrive and grow appropriately along with the rest of the family subsequently, then what you're creating is a larger and larger pool of still at-risk individuals. Many of them have been brought back from the brink of death, but far fewer of them are dying who would have died in previous famines. That doesn't mean they are well. They are the reservoir for mortality for the next crisis that comes along. And that really is something I would like to focus on, is success breeding potential future failure. But let's focus on the positive, where we've been doing a lot right, and we need to learn from that. And a lot of that stuff that's done right needs to be better informing and better dovetailing with the development community, who should be taking up the slack to carry on nurturing and allowing those children to thrive post-crisis. And what we're not seeing is that dovetailing, and that is one of the reasons for the return of famine. Solutions, we need a lot more resources to go into expanding the ability of the programs that Erin was talking about to expand coverage and sustainability of impact over time. She mentioned combined programming. It's not just about treating the child for 6 weeks. It's about what else goes along. When that child goes back to their same household, what's going on in that household is they're exposed to the same foods, the same pathogens, the same environment that they just came out from. And that isn't going to help. That is actually contributing to roughly 1/3 relapse among treated children for severe malnutrition. And therefore, we also need new science. Yes, I am going to add the researcher aspect. We need to better understand when is recovery not recovery. Just reaching a certain weight and then being kicked home again is not adequate recovery to prevent relapse. And otherwise, we're simply retreating a third of the children over and over again, which is adding to the supremely high cost of humanitarian intervention. Now, Dan talked about phase classification. He showed you the maps, and the fact that phase 5 has become rare. The phase 5, which includes explicitly wasting, the incidence and prevalence of child wasting. What are we talking about in a particular context? So wasting matters to that signal, that threshold that we have crossed over from emergency into famine. Right? So that's why wasting recovery has been so good. But to restate what I just said, all the children that we've successfully been treating for wasting over the years who haven't died, where do they reside? Have they come back? I have no idea where the pointer is. Are they here now that they've been treated and they've been discharged from recovery? Or are they here? I would argue most of them are still in these two phases here, right? So the pool of children who have not died but who are still at severe risk of malnutrition and mortality is growing in this space. This is why, when we ask, Luca mentioned, well, maybe famines never went away. Well, maybe the cutoff, the threshold actually was never met, but what we've been seeing is a lot of people stuck in that severe context in these countries. It's not just a humanitarian problem. The Sustainable Development Goals and the World Health Assembly targets for 2025, 2030 include the goal for globally to reduce wasting to less than 5% prevalence and maintaining it below that level. So 5% is seen as not really an acceptable cutoff, but below 5% is seen as manageable and something that isn't going to cause too much harm. It's something we can deal with. But many, many countries around the world are far, far above that 5% in non-emergency years. Sudan obviously springs to mind. Darfur was in the 20s% for many years prior to the Darfur crisis. So high levels of wasting persisting year after year are part of the underlying problem, the problematic of development that isn't being fixed. The most recent malnutrition estimates globally for wasting show, yes, that wasting is concentrated in Africa, South Asia, actually Southern Asia by WHO standards is the hotspot in the world, more so than most of Africa, with rates around 15%, at some countries far above that, which is considered a public health crisis at that level. Right? And those are countries we're not even thinking about or talking about in the context of famine. But for wasting prevalence, that is a problem. In Africa, these are averages for regions. There are many individual countries, as I mentioned, within Africa that have rates far above these regional means, which means we're still a long way from the 5% goal. So I threw together what numbers we have for the 4 famine countries explicitly. On the right, let me just point out that we have to not generalize about malnutrition. The chronic condition that Erin was just talking about, child stunting, children not growing sufficiently in height, is a chronic ongoing situation. Prior to the most recent famines, the most recent data all show significant improvements in the rates of stunting in those famine countries. Right? So it's not every child being involved, and nor is everything going to hell in a handbasket. There were long periods during that 10-year hiatus where things must have been going better because child stunting has been declining. But at the same time, you'll see rates of wasting basically static, if not getting worse, at quite high levels. Right? So wasting and stunting are not the same thing. They are related, but they're not the same thing. And it means that we need to understand that not all malnutrition is alike, and we have to carefully understand the problem and target the solutions. So the World Bank which is not normally known as a humanitarian organization, has understood itself that the evidence of what works, empirical evidence of the effectiveness of interventions to tackle wasting, in this case, they see it's essential that we do something globally, not just in the individual famine response countries, but globally. We've got to prevent this problem from getting worse. And they're talking about it's important to scale up what we know as effective treatment of wasted children, severely acute children. They put the number at 91 million globally. It's not entirely clear what that number should be, somewhere between 75 and 150 million. Over 10 years, that's going to cost roughly $100 a child just for treatment, not even for prevention, but would prevent almost 1 million child deaths, and of course would have knock-on effects for for other adult treatment potential as well. While wasting is the lowest here, the returns on investment that they've calculated show for every dollar spent in treating wasting gives an economic return at the national level of $4, 4 to 1, through productivity not lost, through mortality not lost, through prior investments not lost because of mortality. This is the World Bank saying it, not WFP, not UNICEF, not anyone else. And the evidence of effective intervention continues. Recent evaluation of 4 operations by WFP in the Sahel by 3IE has been showing that when we study carefully what can work and how much it costs to make it work, the agreement is fairly clear, that we are seeing effective interventions that reduce prevalence and incidence of wasting, that combinations of actions tend to work better than single actions. Erin talked about complementary wash and other actions, but in this case, other income streams through food for work type programs or blanket supplementary feeding programs that offer food to other members of the household, not just the target child. There's a lot of ways that one can combine for effect. Now, the costs are not small, but we have to remember that cost effectiveness of intervention matters. When we're talking about the scale of response needed in famines, which usually is tens of millions of people and many billions of dollars in resources, we have to demonstrate and promote the most cost-effective actions possible, even though we typically in the humanitarian imperative say, well, you save the life no matter what the cost. Right? But the cost matters, and there is growing evidence of what cost is coming along. Dan mentioned Boko Haram, almost done here, a new study that was looking at the impact of the Boko Haram conflict on wasting, and concluded that in the absence of conflict in those areas, wasting would have been 13 percentage points lower than it is today. And that's controlling for other parameters of food security, income, food availability, and so on. So the link between conflict and wasting and the dangers of wasting for the economy are pretty well drawn. So finally, concluding slide, millions of children are being treated, but those millions plus the hundreds of millions still not being effectively treated for wasting represent a growing pool of at-risk children. And I'm not even talking yet about adolescents and mothers who are also affected by wasting. We have to take into account that success in saving lives isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next story. And is that going to be a story of resilience and recovery, or is it simply queuing up the next crisis? Management of wasting isn't cheap. I mentioned that it was roughly an average of $100 per child treated, and that's a global average, but many parts of Africa it's much higher than that, 200 to 300 potentially per child treated is noted in some studies. Cost of doing nothing, obviously, is not something we have to entertain, but we now have the World Bank saying, well, but for every dollar invested, you get $4 back, so that's kind of a no-brainer, but somebody's still got to come up with that $1. Who should it be? Is this the responsibility of the humanitarian community or the development community? Where is that kind of investment going to come from, or the government? So wasting bridges humanitarian action and development. It's noted, it's seen, it's a problem for both sides of that equation, and therefore it needs to be understood and managed from both sides of the problem, not just seen as something for the Aaron Boyds of the world to go in and fix in the short term. Thank you. And may the 4th be with you.